Why do films look different? That's a big question. I mean, it's a pretty broad question, but it's a question that I think is important to tackle. So I'm going to take this from an angle of saying literally how it looks. Literally, why do films from years and decades ago look different from today? And there's a whole bunch of reasons, but I think I've narrowed it into four main areas. So I want to run through these four with you. So the very first one is cost-influenced style evolution. Now, what do I mean by that? It's kind of a weird mix of words. I just kind of threw it together. But the big thing, the big idea is that the cost of production had a big impact on the style that cinematographers from, the 50s or the 40s or the 60s and 70s were creating. So if you think about movies like The Sound of Music, a lot of those films are taken place at like a wider angle and they play a large part of the scene before they cut to a close-up. And if you watch these older films, a lot of these films are from a wider POV, kind of like you're watching a stage play, but it's really like the camera's like in a third person position, just watching from a wide angle the scene play out. And then the older you go, the more you see that. And the main reason is, there's a whole bunch of reasons, but the main reason is this style was influenced by the fact that you're shooting on film, and film is expensive. And so there wasn't a ton of opportunity for cinematographers and for directors to have hundreds of, cutaway shots and to get very full coverage for some scenes. Even Steven Spielberg, back when he was doing Jaws, he had a very modest budget. It was one of his big first films that really took off. And I believe that because of that, it influenced Spielberg's cinematography to start implementing something called the Spielberg Oneer. And that basically is a very long shot. Now, we've all seen films like Birdman and The Revenant, and where a majority of the film is all like one long take. But Steven Spielberg really was using a one angle shot for a long period of time, I believe, in order to save money on costs and not have to do the scene over and over and over again from a bunch of different angles. It not only saves time during production, but it's literally saving the amount of film that has to be used to capture that scene appropriately. So a big part of that is the cost of film and the cost of resources on production would limit a cinematographer, a filmmaker, and they would actually create a style around those constraints. And today, if you look at films like, John Wick, you have a fight scene that's just a couple of seconds long, but they will cut through 8 different shots in just a few second little fight scene. Think about the old Jackie Chan movies where they would have real intense choreography fight scenes, and it's from a position of a wide angle and it's just following the fight around. And then we get modern cinematography where the camera's moving. There's a lot of really dynamic angles and compositions, but it's just honestly a bunch of cutaways. And the main reason for that is because digital obviously doesn't cost us anything extra to hit record and stop recording. It's not using a physical product like film is that is costly. And so modern styles evolve with that new technology. And now we're getting a lot more fast-paced, heavy cutaways, a lot more dynamic films. The next area that really makes old and new films look so incredibly different is the dynamic range. And I'm calling this dynamic range crutch, kind of referring to today's modern filmmakers. This is not a across-the-board statement, but it is something that myself and a lot of other filmmakers and production individuals have noticed and can get a little frustrated by. But first things first, what is dynamic range? Dynamic range is basically the ability to see the scope of both darks and bright highlights in an image. And some of the old film cameras were pretty limited and they count them in stops, right? So if you take a look at this, the human eye's dynamic range is 24 stops, and the average DSLR mirrorless camera has 14 stops. So you see that little red outline. It kind of shows you how much dynamic range going into the darks and the highlights that a camera can see. The old camera's dynamic range was a lot smaller, and as time progresses, dynamic range is becoming a lot more wide, getting closer and closer to literally what the human eye can see at 24 stops of lighting exposure. And even Sony has put out a very popular camera. It's called the Sony FX3. I have used this camera. It is a lot of fun to use, and it's very popular in the filmmaking space just because it's a consumer camera. It's only around $3,000, and they're using this camera in Hollywood production. So it's a very affordable Hollywood approved camera that has 15 stops of dynamic range. So as cameras and camera technology progresses, the dynamic range stops are progressing. But if you take a look at this at the very top, you can see that it's a cinematic camera. And that is basically probably like a Red or an ARRI or something that's just very cinematic with a lot of dynamic range. And below that is the Canon 5D Mark III, which has less dynamic range than a cinematic camera. And if you look at the sky and even the trees, you can see that the sky is a lot more blown out. Even the backdrop to the trees are a lot more blown out. So basically, certain cameras can see into the shadows and see into the highlights at much more detail without it peaking, clipping out in the highlights or in the shadows. Again, on the image below that one, the camera exposed for both examples on the ground, like the earth, the green grass. So there's not a whole lot of differentiating between the amount of exposure on the grass. But if you work up into the mountains and in the sky, you see there's a much different look in both of those examples. And so these are very clear pictures of what very high dynamic range or low dynamic range will offer you. And very simply, those old cinematic cameras just had less dynamic range than you have in digital cameras today. Now, digital cameras have the upper hand to be able to shoot with a really high dynamic range, and then you can do a color grade that really brings down the shadows and ups the highlights and really stabilizes and create a really dynamic, no pun intended, but a really dynamic lighting and color exposure. But in order to capture that high dynamic range is that these digital cameras shoot something called log footage. And that's basically where it crushes your highlights and shadows so that nothing is clipping. And when it does that, it also mutes the colors. So if you look at this example from Wicked, there was a lot of people online kind of feeling a type of way because when you look at that, you can see the blues, you can see her green skin, but overall the image feels flat. It doesn't feel like it has a lot of dynamic contrast in the image, and all of the colors are a bit muted to where there's kind of like this faded gray almost, and it's simply because they didn't push it that far when it came to color grading. Whereas in the example from Star Wars: A New Hope, you see all of the little shadows, you see all of the different contrasts in the image, and a big part of that is because you have to light for a low dynamic range camera, and old cameras were not able to shoot log footage. And so essentially you are getting what you get. Now you can adjust the exposure in the image, but you cannot crush the signal to avoid clipping. All that has to be done on set. So when I go back to the beginning of this section and say the dynamic range crutch, I would say that on production with certain filmmakers and certain creators, there's a little bit of a laziness culture that's being brought on production and then afterwards in the color grading of your images, because you are filming and you're just kind of like, oh, it's really easy to keep your footage safe from highlights and shadows, but that's creating laziness all the way through and ultimately ending with something like we see here from Wicked that is kind of looking gray, and it's not super dynamic with the contrast and not very extremely real looking in the image itself. The next thing we have that really makes old and new films different is the loss of practicals. I think the big obvious example you think of when you think of practicals is Jurassic Park, because they literally made dinosaurs with practical effects. Now, the original Jurassic Park also had some animation, some video effects in it, and it was not as good as today, but there's so much of Jurassic Park that is utilizing dinosaurs that are animatronics, that are practicals. And there's really something romantic, I think, about some of those old practical uses, especially in horror films. I honestly think in today's world, you really should be using practicals, especially if you're a low budget horror film creator, because practicals have a visceral response. Even if it doesn't look as realistic as you can make some animation these days, like from Jurassic World, this example, that Velociraptor Blue, he looks so real, but there's a missing component, and it's kind of like when you watch it, you know if it's fake or real, and so it kind of loses its ability to feel visceral. I mean, when there's light coming through a window, it's going to hit your practical environments and your practical characters and dinosaurs in a very specific way that the human's eye and psychology is trained to pick up. Whereas you can make it look super real with video effects and animation, but there's always going to be something inside your mind that allows you to detach from it, because you know that it's not really there. Somehow our brain knows that it's not real, whereas with practicals, it's really there, and you can really get a visceral reaction with practicals. Also think of like The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. I mean, the Lord of the Rings was filmed in the late 90s, early 2000s. And so they had so much practicals. They also had animation, but they had so much use of practicals that really grounded a lot of characters like, the orcs and the Uruk-hai. And then you get to The Hobbit, where they made their lead antagonist white orc, Azog, I believe is his name, and he's fully animated. Like, he's a fully animated orc. And again, it just disconnects you a bit. It just removes you from that practical, tangible experience that draws an audience in further. And then the other example is kind of like Jaws versus the Meg, right? The Meg film, where there's a completely animated giant shark. I would be willing to say, even though there are definitely scenes where Jaws looks very not real, just because we've been desensitized with decades of animation in films, Jaws has a very horrifying feel to it, and it's very, again, I keep using this word, visceral. I think that's because it's important. It's because it's a valid descriptor word for practicals, where you watch the Meg and it can be frightening, but you also know it's totally not real and not there, and so your brain is not picking it up as a threat, or it's not picking it up as genuine. The last area I think that makes films look different is film is messy, where digital is flawless. To get an image on film, it's literally being imprinted, burned, if you will, by light onto a physical structure, and that is what we call film. And it's very delicate when it comes to light exposure. So light passes in through the lens. It's literally stuck onto this physical frame, and then you capture it again on another piece and another piece and another piece. And you do that roughly 24 times per second, where digital is just literally a sensor that is able to monitor light and receive or reject light based on its color. And then it just captures a digital image of that, and it's gone. Now it's all digital. There's nothing physically imprinted. With film, it has to literally go through a whole process of chemicals being bathed on it, as well as washing and then drying. And in the whole time, you have to make sure that no light, hits it, right? So they do it in dark rooms, like red light rooms, that can't affect the film, because it'll just completely erase what you captured as far as an image until it's been processed. And in the old days, you literally had to stitch film together like this in order to create an actual completed film. A film editor wasn't so much someone who knew how to work a computer, A film editor back in the day was someone who was stitching film together with a specific kind of tape and a cutter, right? And so the process of using film to get your image is very messy. I mean, the chemical process will literally create very small but significant changes to the color and the exposure of your image. And digital just doesn't have that. Whatever the settings were on the camera and whatever you were seeing, it's gonna give you that. And it's super clean. I mean, even the final result of, film footage versus digital footage, film has a little bit more grain to it. The way it looks at bright lights and shadows. It's not necessarily a difference in dynamic range, but what it is it's experiencing light differently than a sensor is. And then through the process, it can create small distortions and small imperfections. And actually, there are certain creators that find those imperfections very interesting and preferable. If you all watched The Batman from a handful of years ago, by Matt Reeves, and the cinematographer was Greg Fraser. They actually shot the whole film digitally on ARRI cameras, and then they colored the film. So the film was clean, it was crisp, it was all done. And what they did was they took that and then captured it onto film, right? Onto a physical piece of film. And then they processed it and then used what it actually gave them, because even though the film was crisp and clean and perfect visually, they wanted to dirty it up. They wanted to get that romantic imperfection in some of the images to create more intrigue. It's almost romantic in a way. And so they actually intentionally dirtied up the entire film after it was completely done digitally, both in shooting and the color grade. And I actually go into way more details along with that information on this one video right here about how interesting the production of the Batman was. If you want to hear more about that from the creators themselves, check this video out.